Welcome back to the channel, everyone. If you love captivating stories about men transforming into women in unique and fascinating ways, then be sure to subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. Now, let's jump right into today's tale.
Kristin pulled into her grandmother's driveway, her heart hammering in her chest with enough force that she worried it might crack one of her new, delicate ribs. The BMW's tires crunched over the familiar gravel, the same sound Kyle's old sedan had made countless times, yet somehow sharper to her newly sensitive ears. She barely remembered the actual drive over. Her mind had been too preoccupied with what had happened that morning. Her new body, her new life, her very concerning reaction to the man at the intersection. "Get it together, Thompson," she muttered to herself, catching a glimpse of her unfamiliar face in the rearview mirror. Those green eyes. Her grandmother's eyes stared back at her, framed by thick lashes that should have required mascara, but apparently came standard with this model. "You're just here for answers. Find out what Gran did, how to undo it, and then get back to your normal life. A life where she didn't have to worry about walking in heels, or figuring out bra sizes, or feeling inexplicable flutters in her stomach when attractive men jogged past." Kristin took a deep breath, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles went white against her pale skin. Answers? That's what she needed. She just hoped her grandmother had them, and wasn't just going to cackle maniacally while stirring a cauldron or something equally unhelpful. Though at this point, "I wouldn't even be surprised," she muttered, finally releasing the wheel and reaching for her purse. The motion felt unsettlingly natural, like her body had performed it thousands of times before, which, according to one set of memories, it had. Stepping out of the car, she smoothed down her hoodie, trying not to think about how different her slim, curvy figure felt in clothes. The fabric clung to places that shouldn't have curves, hung loose where there should have been bulk. Every movement felt strange yet familiar, like wearing something that wasn't hers but fit perfectly. She walked up the porch steps, her heeled boots clicking against the wood with a rhythm that echoed ominously in her ears. The sound of approaching doom, she thought dramatically, or just the sound of overpriced footwear. Kristin hesitated for only a second before reaching for the door, and it swung open before she could knock. Her grandmother stood there, looking exactly as she had the previous evening. Silver hair perfectly coiffed, bright eyes twinkling, dressed in a floral blouse and slacks that somehow managed to look both grandmotherly and elegant. The only difference was the knowing smile that curved her lips, weeder and more mischievous than usual. "Good morning, Kristin." "Dear." Kristin froze, her stomach dropping like she'd just plummeted down the first hill of a roller coaster. Her grandmother hadn't hesitated, hadn't questioned why a strange woman was standing at her door, hadn't shown even a flicker of surprise at the stunning redhead who had replaced her grandson. She knew. Kristin swallowed. "90." Her mouth suddenly dry. You know?" Her grandmother's smile widened, eyes twinkling with a spark that could only be described as impish. She looked less like a sweet old lady, and more like a cat who had successfully stolen an entire fish from the dinner table without getting caught. "Of course, sweetheart. Now, come in. Take a seat in the lounge. I'll make us some tea." She turned, already heading toward the kitchen, with the spry step of a woman decades younger. Over her shoulder, she added, "Unless you'd prefer something stronger, I have a lovely bourbon that your grandfather saved for special occasions. It's 9 in the morning." "Gran," Kristin replied automatically, then paused, startled by How easily the interaction flowed, as if they'd been having these exchanges her entire life, which, again, according to one set of memories, they had. "It's 5 o'clock somewhere," her grandmother called back cheerfully, "and if ever there was a morning that called for bourbon." "Pa, I imagine this might be it." Kristin hesitated, her mind spinning, but her feet moved automatically. Stepping inside. The house smelled the same, lavender, cinnamon, and old books, but she could already tell that everything else had changed. Photos on the walls featured a red-headed girl instead of a brown new-haired boy. The knitted throw on the back of the couch was now a soft mint green instead of the navy blue Kyle had always remembered. She walked into the lounge room, a cozy space filled with antique furniture and soft floral patterns. She sat down on the couch at first, hands resting on her knees, trying to process everything. "This is insane," she whispered to herself. "I'm sitting in my grandmother's living room. Why? In a woman's body, waiting for her to explain why she turned me into this." She gestured down at herself, still not quite believing the curves and contours beneath her clothes were actually hers. Then, her eyes drifted to the mantelpiece above the fireplace. Kristin stood up slowly, her gaze locking onto the photos lined up across the shelf. She walked toward them, drawn by an unsettling curiosity. She knew these pictures, or at least, she shouldn't have. But the moment she laid eyes on them, now, memories surfaced. There she was, a little girl, all red curls and bright green eyes, grinning while holding a stuffed rabbit. The memory bubbled up unbidden. 5th birthday. The rabbit's name was Mr. Whiskers, and she'd insisted on taking him everywhere for almost 2 years until his stuffing started leaking out one ear. Another photo. Her at 6 years old, missing her 2 front teeth, standing between a man and woman. Her parents. The same parents Kyle had, but somehow different. Her father's arm was draped more affectionately around little Kristin's shoulders than it had ever been around Kyle's. Her mother was kneeling beside her, their matching red hair catching the sunlight. Kristin's breath hitched as the memory flooded in. Oh, clear as day. The warmth of her mother's arms as she hugged her after a ballet recital. The deep laughter of her father as he lifted her onto his shoulders at a carnival, saying, "Up you go, princess. See if you can touch the clouds." Princess. Not sport or champ like he'd called Kyle. It was real. But it wasn't. Because she had another set of memories. Of being Kyle. Of growing up as a boy. Of having a completely different childhood. No ballet recitals, but little league baseball games. No princess, but plenty of sport. Same parents. Different relationship. Kristin took a shaky step back, her head buzzing from the conflicting timelines. "I remember both," she whispered, fingers brushing against her temple. "How is that possible? How can I remember a life I never lived?" Her eyes drifted further down the mantel, stopping on a black and white photo she'd never noticed before, or had it always been there? It showed her grandmother, young and stunning, standing beside a group of other people. Some laughing, some serious, but the way they were posed, the way they looked, Kristin's stomach twisted. They weren't just any people, they were witches. She knew it in her gut. The way they stood, confident and powerful. The subtle symbols embroidered on their clothing. The glint in their eyes that, even captured in an old photograph, spoke of secrets and power. And right in the center, her grandmother looking exactly like Kristin did now, minus the modern clothing and styled hair. Holy shit, she breathed. Gran was actually a witch. Like a real spell casting, potion brewing witch. She leaned closer, examining the faces in the photo. And she had a whole coven. A sharp clink of porcelain pulled her out of her thoughts. Her grandmother walked back into the room, carrying a silver tea tray with a china teapot, 2 cups, and a plate of cookies that smelled like they'd just come out of the oven. Though Kristin hadn't smelled any baking when she arrived. She set it down on the coffee table with a graceful ease that belied her age, then glanced up at Kristin, following her gaze to the photos. Oh, I remember that day, she mused, pouring tea into the delicate cups with practiced precision. Not a drop spilled, despite the hefty weight of the silver pot. That was at the park, when your parents took you for a picnic. You were so excited about the ducks. You tried to chase them into the pond. Your mother nearly had a heart attack. But your father just laughed and said you had adventurous spirit. Staring, her mouth slightly agape. I didn't. That wasn't. She shook her head, red hair swishing around her shoulders. That never happened. Gran. I was Kyle. Kyle never chased ducks. Her grandmother simply smiled, handing her a cup. The delicate china looked absurdly small in Kristin's hands, which, while now feminine and graceful, still felt too large for such dainty objects. Sugar? Gran asked, as if they were just having their regular Sunday chat. As if her grandson hadn't turned into her granddaughter overnight. Kristin hesitated, her hands slightly shaking as she accepted the cup. Gran, please, what's happening? What did you do to me? She wanted to say something more, to ask a million questions, but her mouth couldn't form the words. It was as if her brain was still buffering, struggling to process the magnitude of what had happened. Her grandmother sighed, knowingly, sitting down in her favorite chair, an antique wingback that had been reupholstered so many times over the years that Kyle used to joke it was like Theseus's ship. Not a thread of the original remaining. Yes, dear, it was me. I did this. She said it so casually, like confessing to borrowing a sweater without asking. Not fundamentally altering someone's entire existence. Kristin nearly dropped her teacup. You did? You admit it? Just like that? Would you prefer I deny it? Her grandmother raised a perfectly arched eyebrow. Perhaps claim you've always been Kristin, and Kyle was just some strange dream you had? No. Kristin set the cup down, afraid she'd spill tea all over herself in her agitation. You can't just transform people. That's not how the world works. Her grandmother chuckled, the sound oddly musical. My dear, the world works exactly how those with power make it work. And our family has always had certain gifts. Gifts? Gifts? Kristin's voice rose an octave. You call turning your grandson into a woman a gift. Keep your voice down. Dear, Mrs. Abernathy next door is terribly nosy, and I'd rather not have her thinking I've gone senile and am arguing with myself. Her grandmother took a slow sip of tea before adding, though, to be fair, this is more of a byproduct of what you really asked for. Kristin's hands trembled as she reached forward, taking the cup of tea again, if only to have something to hold on to. Something tangible in a world that had suddenly become very intangible. A byproduct? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What are you talking about? I never asked to be turned into a woman. Her grandmother set her teacup down with a decisive clink. No, you asked for help with your fantasy football team. You said, and I quote, I need a woman's intuition. People say things like that all the time. They don't mean it literally. Perhaps her grandmother conceded with a slight nod. But the magic heard your wish. And magic, dear, takes things quite literally. Magic, Kristin repeated flatly. You're seriously telling me that magic did this? Like, abracadabra, poof. You're a woman now. Well, no? It was a bit more complicated than that. Her grandmother said, Mom? Looking slightly offended. There were incantations, powerful crystals, planetary alignments. It was quite sophisticated spellwork, if I do say so myself. Kristin stared at her, dumbfounded. You're actually proud of this? Of what you did to me? I'm proud of using my gifts effectively. Yes, her grandmother replied, unruffled. And I think you'll find that what I've given you is precisely what you asked for. Kristin nearly choked on her tea. I asked for football advice, not estrogen. Her grandmother waved a dismissive hand. Details, details. The point is, you needed a woman's perspective to improve your fantasy football performance. And what better way to gain that perspective than to experience it firsthand? There were about 1,000 better ways, Kristin exclaimed. You could have, I don't know, just given me advice? Like a normal grandmother. Draft this quarterback. Avoid that running back. Simple. And would you have listened? Her grandmother fixed her with a knowing look. Or would you have nodded politely, and then gone right back to your spreadsheets and statistics? Convinced that your way was better? Kristin opened her mouth to protest, then closed it again. Kyle had been notoriously stubborn about his fantasy football strategy. It was part of what made his continued failure so frustrating. He was convinced he had the perfect system, despite all evidence to the contrary. That's not the point, she finally said. The point is, you can't just magically change someone's gender without their consent. I don't see why not, her grandmother replied with a shrug. It worked, didn't it? The spell took beautifully. You look absolutely stunning. By the way, you have my bone structure. Gran! Kristin's voice rose again in frustration. This isn't about how I look. This is about the fact that I woke up this morning as a completely different person. Not completely different, her grandmother corrected. You're still you. Just the female version of you. All your core traits remain the same. Your intelligence, your sense of humor, your absurd devotion to that silly fantasy game. Kristin buried her face in her hands, her long hair falling forward to curtain her from view. This can't be happening. Her grandmother reached forward, patting her knee consolingly. There, dear. It's not as bad as all that. Look on the bright side, you have fantastic hair now. I always thought Kyle's haircut was too short. No dimension at all. Kristin looked up from between her fingers. That's your bright side. That I have better hair. Well, that and the fact that your fantasy football team is already improving, her grandmother said with a smile. You moved up in the standings overnight, didn't you? I believe your phone mentioned something about it. Kristin's eyes widened. How did you know that? Did you cast a spell on my team too? Don't be ridiculous. Her grandmother scoffed. I merely gave you the tools you need to succeed. The intuition, the insight, the feminine perspective that lets you see beyond mere statistics. That's not how fantasy football works, Kristin protested. It's about numbers and performance metrics and yet, her grandmother interrupted. Why, your team has already improved, hasn't it? After just one night as Kristin? Kristin fell silent, processing this information. It was true. Her phone had shown a notification about her team moving up in the standings. But that had to be a coincidence, right? It couldn't possibly be related to this. She barely whispered the words. What do you mean by product? Her grandmother's eyes gleamed with that same mischievous light Kristin had seen the night before. The gender change, dear. It's just a vehicle for delivering what you really asked for. The intuition, the insight, the connection to the more subtle energies that men typically ignore. So you're saying? Kristin began slowly, trying to wrap her mind around this bizarre explanation. I'm saying, her grandmother continued, leaning forward slightly, that your transformation is merely the means to an end. The end being, of course, winning your little fantasy game. Kristin stared at her, speechless. All this, her new body, her altered reality, her shifted memories, all for a fantasy football league? You've got to be kidding me. She finally managed. Kristin sat there, fingers curled around the delicate china teacup, her mind spinning like a hamster wheel, going nowhere fast. The fine porcelain felt fragile beneath her touch, much like her grasp on reality at this moment. She had just heard the words, had just processed them, but they still didn't feel real. They floated in the air between them. Impossible, and yet undeniable. Her grandmother, sweet, mischievous, cookie, baking grandma, had just admitted to turning her into a woman. And now, she was implying even more. Wait, Kristin said, holding up a hand. You're telling me you turned me into a woman just so I could win at fantasy football? That's the most absurd thing I've ever heard. Her grandmother simply chuckled, the sound warm and rich. Well, when you put it that way, it does sound a bit extreme. But magic rarely does things by half-it measures, dear. Kristin swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper, when she finally managed to form words again. What do you mean? A byproduct? Her grandmother simply smiled, leaning back in her chair as she took a slow, deliberate sip of tea. The steam curled up from the cup, dancing in the morning light that filtered through the lace curtains. She looked perfectly at ease, as if discussing the weather or sharing a family recipe rather than explaining how she'd completely upended her grandson's existence. Well, darling, our family comes from a long line of witches, she began, her tone as casual as if she were discussing whether it might rain later. It's something that's been passed down for generations, though only the women in our line can harness magic. Kristin blinked, her grip tightening on the teacup until her knuckles whitened. The liquid inside trembled, small ripples spreading across its amber surface. That irony wasn't lost on her. So you're saying? Kristin began slowly, struggling to keep her voice steady. That you couldn't teach Kyle magic because he was a man. So you... What? Decided to fix that little problem. Her grandmother waved a dismissive hand. Oh, it wasn't quite so calculated as all that. The spell was meant to grant you what you asked for. Intuition, luck, a winning edge. The gender change was simply the most efficient path to that outcome. Efficient, Kristin repeated flatly. No. You call this efficient? Her grandmother chuckled at her expression, her eyes crinkling at the corners. And since, up until now, there weren't any women left to pass it to, well, you can imagine my surprise when this all worked out so neatly. Surprise? Kristin's voice rose incredulously. You cast the spell. How could you be surprised by the outcome? Magic has its own way of fulfilling wishes. Dear, her grandmother replied, unruffled. I merely set the intention. The universe decides the method of delivery. She sipped her tea again. Though I must say, it does seem to have a sense of humor. Kristin's stomach twisted like a pretzel as the full implications began to sink in. So, now, you're saying that I'm... Her grandmother nodded, cutting her off. A witch? Yes, dear. Kristin opened her mouth, then closed it, resembling nothing so much as a particularly beautiful goldfish. The teacup trembled in her hand, and she quickly set it down before she could spill it all over her grandmother's antique Persian rug. That was a lot to take in. She was a witch. Actual spell, casting, potion, brewing, possibly broomstick or riding witch, like her grandmother, like the women in that black and white photograph. I don't feel very witchy, she finally managed, looking down at her hands as if expecting to see sparks shooting from her fingertips. Well, of course not, her grandmother scoffed. You've been a witch for all of... She glanced at the ornate grandfather clock in the corner. About 6 hours. These things take time to develop. It's not like the movies where you wave a wand and suddenly you're Merlin. I think Merlin was a wizard. Not a witch, Kristin, corrected automatically. Then shook her head. That's not the point. The point is, you've turned me into something completely different without my consent. Different, yes. Completely? I wouldn't say that. Her grandmother reached for a cookie, taking a dainty bite. You're still you, dear. Just with enhancements. Enhancements? Kristin gestured wildly at her chest. You call these enhancements? Well, they are quite lovely, her grandmother remarked with an appraising eye. You're welcome, by the way. Kristin buried her face in her hands. This can't be happening. But her grandmother wasn't finished. Now, as for why this happened the way it did, she continued, setting her cup down with a decisive clink. Magic, real magic, has a sense of balance. You can't just take and take without something being given in return. Oh, there's always a price. Kristin frowned, peeking out from between her fingers. A price? Her grandmother nodded, her expression turning more serious. You wish for luck. And not just a small amount of luck. You wanted to be the luckiest you could possibly be. That doesn't just extend to your little fantasy football league, dear. That's luck in everything. Your whole life. Every aspect of it. Kristin's heartbeat thumped louder in her chest. A drum beat of realization. She remembered her exact words from the night before. I'd trade anything to win this year. Anything. That's what she'd said. Luck in everything? So... You're saying I'm going to be lucky now? She asked cautiously. Like winning the lottery lucky? Perhaps, her grandmother replied cryptically, though magic rarely works in such obvious ways. But yes, fortune will favor you far more than it did before. Kristin considered this. Being lucky wouldn't be so bad, would it? Even if it came with, well, significant anatomical adjustments. Her grandmother continued. So, to balance something that powerful, something had to be either removed or changed. She gestured towards Kristin with a knowing smile. And in your case? I chose change. Kristin's breath caught in her throat. Her manhood, her entire identity, had been the price. And her grandmother had decided this for her. Just like that. You didn't think to. I don't know. Ask me first, Kristin demanded, a flash of anger cutting through her confusion. Hey, Kyle, how would you feel about becoming a woman in exchange for supernatural luck? Would that have been so hard? Oh, you would have said no, her grandmother replied with absolute certainty. Exactly. Kristin exclaimed. Because it's insane. And then, you would have continued losing at your game. And complaining about it. And being miserable. Her grandmother continued as if Kristin hadn't spoken. This way. Everyone wins. Everyone, except Kyle. Kristin muttered. Kyle is part of you now, her grandmother said, her voice softening slightly. Just as Kristin is. Two sides of the same coin. No, two versions of the same soul. Now. Kristin leaned back, staring at the tea in her hands. The liquid had cooled, much like her initial panic. In its place was a strange, resigned curiosity. This was insane, but at the same time. She glanced up at her grandmother, the twinkle in her eyes, the way she looked at Kristin with pride, warmth, happiness. There was something there that Kristin had never seen before, or perhaps had never noticed. A connection, a recognition. Something about it made her pause. You've been waiting for this, haven't you? Kristin asked quietly. For someone to pass your magic to? Her grandmother's smile faltered slightly, a rare glimpse of vulnerability crossing her features. It's been lonely, she admitted. Being the last of my kind in the family. Magic is meant to be shared, to be taught. When your mother showed no signs of the gift, and then you were born male. She shrugged. I resigned myself to being the end of the line. Her grandmother had never had daughters, and Kristin's parents, Kyle's parents, had never had any other children. There had been no one to pass this magic down to. Until now. Kristin exhaled slowly, her mind racing through the implications. She had wished for luck and had paid the price in the form of her manhood. But in exchange she had become something more. So what happens now? She asked, setting her cup down. Do I get a broomstick and a black cat? Start cackling at the moon? Her grandmother rolled her eyes. Such stereotypes. No. No. Dear Tide. Now, you begin learning. The craft is complex, deep, rich with history and tradition. There's so much I can teach you, spells for protection, rituals for healing, ways to connect with the natural world that most people never experience. There was such enthusiasm in her voice, such passion that Kristin couldn't help but be affected by it. Her grandmother was happy, happier than Kristin had ever seen her. The usual mischievous twinkle had transformed into a full, blown glow. And that, for some reason, made something inside her soften. She could panic later. Right now. She set her teacup down, leaned forward slightly, and gave her grandmother a small, almost playful smile. So, fine, Kristin said, tilting her head, red hair cascading over one shoulder like a fiery waterfall. I'm a witch now, too? Her grandmother's face lit up, her smile widening into something truly joyful, years seeming to fall away from her in an instant. She reached across the coffee table, taking Kristin's hands in her own. Yes, she said, her voice thick with emotion. And a powerful one, I suspect. Our lineage is ancient, reaching back to the old country. The magic in your blood has been dormant, waiting. Now, it can finally express itself. For the first time since she had woken up in this body. Kristin saw something she hadn't expected to see. Her grandmother had never been happier. There was a light in those familiar green eyes. The same eyes that now stared back at Kristin from her own reflection, that spoke of relief, of hope, of a burden finally lifted. The loneliness of being the last witch in the family had clearly weighed on her grandmother more than she'd ever let on. I don't know the first thing about being a witch, Kristin admitted, surprising herself with the lack of anger in her voice. No one does at the beginning. I didn't know, her grandmother assured her. But you will learn. I'll teach you everything my mother taught me, and her mother before her. The traditional spells, the modern adaptations, the herbs, the crystals, the cycles of the moon. Kristin couldn't help but laugh, a sound that came out higher and more melodic than she was used to. And all because I wanted to win at fantasy football. Her grandmother joined in the laughter, hers a deeper, knowing chuckle. The universe works in mysterious ways, dear. Sometimes what we think we want is just a doorway to what we truly need. I'm pretty sure I didn't need breasts, Kristin retorted, though there was no real heat behind it. Perhaps not, her grandmother conceded, but our family needed another witch, and the magic found a way to make that happen. She squeezed Kristin's hands. Try not to think of it as losing something, but as gaining something far more precious. Kristin wasn't entirely convinced, but the genuine happiness on her grandmother's face was hard to argue with. Besides, if what she said was true, if Kristin really was lucky now, maybe this whole bizarre situation would turn out better than expected. So, she said, pulling her hands back and reaching for a cookie. Suddenly ravenous, this luck thing. How does it work exactly? Do I just automatically win bets now? Should I buy lottery tickets? Place some sports wagers? Her grandmother scared. Magic is more subtle than that. Dear, it's not about guaranteeing outcomes, but about nudging probabilities, creating opportunities, opening doors that might otherwise remain closed. That sounds conveniently vague, Kristin observed, biting into the cookie. It was buttery and perfect, melting on her tongue. Though I suppose if my team did move up in the standings overnight. Precisely, her grandmother nodded. And that's just the beginning. You'll find that things simply work out for you now. Not always in the ways you expect, but always in ways that benefit you in the long run. Kristin considered this, licking a crumb from her lip. I guess there are worse things than being a lucky witch. Many worse things, her grandmother agreed. Now, shall we begin your first lesson? There's a basic protection spell I think would be good to start with. Very practical. Kristin hesitated. Nah, then shrugged. What did she have to lose at this point? Her masculinity was already gone, replaced by curves and a voice that could probably get her into any club without waiting in line. Sure, she said, dusting cookie crumbs from her fingers. Why not? Teach me how to be a witch, Gran. Her grandmother beamed, rising from her chair with surprising agility for a woman her age. Wonderful. Let's go up to the attic. Oh, that's where I keep all my supplies. As Kristin followed her mother toward the stairs, a strange thought occurred to her. Kyle had spent his whole life trying to win at fantasy football, analyzing stats, studying players, creating elaborate spreadsheets, and failing miserably. Maybe, just maybe, Kristin would succeed where Kyle had failed. And wouldn't that be the ultimate irony?